Teddy, darling, can you sit up? Can you sit up? You want to join us? Yeah. Oh, there you are. Hi. Okay. Well, that's really good. So, shall we introduce our little program and our guest? Should we? You ready? Okay. Have you got something to say? Maybe. Is there anything you'd like to say? There we go. There is a hello and welcome to Pet Talk with me. I'm Anna, and this is, who are you? Would you like to say who you are? Teddy. And we are joined today by Daniel Shaw, who is, I think, one of the most interesting people I've heard on the subject of dog bites and aggression. And so, welcome, Daniel.
Oh, thank you for that lovely introduction. It's great to be here.
Um, it's such a big thing, because it's dog bites are so often in the news, and dogs are usually blamed, and yet I've always had a sense that there's more to the story than meets the eye. So I guess maybe a good place to start might be in talking about what drives a dog to bite, and are we able to categorize different bites, so that some are more about warning whilst others might be more with an intention to defend? Is there something going on along those lines?
Yeah, I think there is. And I think it's one of those things that it does depend on who you ask as well. Because there's, for example, one way aggression and aggressive behavior is categorized as in terms of reactive aggression and then sort of more proactive aggression. Or operant style aggression even, and that's essentially looking at aggression that's coming in response to an unexpected stimulus, being that reactive aggression. So, for example, if someone burst into my house right now and I wasn't expecting it, then I might be preparing to either fight or run away, without really thinking about what's the goal in this. It's happening as a reactive. It's in a reactive situation, whereas we might see something more operant style or instrumental aggression, I think is the kind of the term that comes up in the literature a lot. Instrumental aggression may refer to if, for example, we're talking about a dog that is experiencing some threat to their resources. So maybe they're feeling like a particular sleeping space or a particular food item or a particular whatever it may be is under threat. Then they may use that aggression as a means to gain some reinforcement. So that's one way that it can be categorized. So thinking about actually whether the dog is acting in such a way that they are considering the reinforcers at play in a scenario. So that meaning if we're thinking about the dog's brain, that means their learning system is getting involved and saying, actually, if you do this, this, and this in this scenario, then this can help you access that reinforcer. And as we know from learning theory, right, of course, that reinforcer can be a positive reinforcer. So getting some food, that's not something you see too often, but it could be a negative reinforcer, so actually making something unpleasant go away, or the reactive aggression being more looking at some of those fear systems in the brain activating. So the dog in being in a situation, recognizing that there's a potential threat and getting into that defensive response without necessarily thinking about what the reinforcement opportunities are in that occasion. And then there's some people that would argue that there's an overlap between those as well. So that's one way of looking at it. But equally, there's many other ways that aggression's been categorized, or dog bites and dog incidents like this have been categorized. So there's people that would categorize them into sort of fear-based / anxiety-based slash or compared to frustration related, redirected, and all these different ways of categorizing the behavior. So there's no standard approach for categorizing these sorts of things. I think it comes down to actually what is the most useful way to categorize this in terms of understanding the situation, understanding the risks involved for this dog, and both in the past and in the future, and understanding what we need to do going forward with this dog, whether we're talking about a behavior plan, whether we're talking about a dog in a legal setting and we're thinking about how can we get this dog back to their home safely, and being able to tell a court, being able to tell, often I work with people like, fostering adoption agencies, and actually thinking about if we have got a dog that maybe is more on the fear and anxiety prone, how can we ensure that we're keeping everyone safe in that environment in the future as well? So there's lots of utility, I would say, for understanding those different ways we can categorize aggression.
There's so much in what you've just said, and listening to you, I was curious as to what led you to kind of almost be specializing now in this field. What led you in this direction? Was it personal experience?
Is that the dog behavior field you're thinking of generally, or kind of the aggression cases?
Because obviously you're a dog behaviorist, but I'm just wondering what has led you to explore this so closely.
Yeah, so it's interesting you say it, 'cause I never market myself as someone that's specialized or anything like that. I do mainly take behavior cases, so I don't do a lot of training, agility style training or anything like that. I wouldn't know where to start in that sort of situation. But I think I certainly do see a lot of aggression cases, and I think the reason for that, for one part, actually more than anything, is the demand. So I see, we've got a lot of people that really, really struggle with their dogs showing aggression and displaying aggression, and that, I think, tells us a lot about where the dog population are at the moment, because we've got a lot of dogs in our country that I would say aren't seeming very happy, or certainly the area I live on, my local area, that are really struggling and aren't very happy. So I think there's a lot to do there, and it kind of becomes then also one of those things that, as you're having some success with working with these cases, as you feel you're able to make a difference with these sorts of cases, that's perhaps the sort of case then, if I am, because we're quite fortunate that we've got quite a big team, quite a lot of inquiries coming in, that I kind of lean towards maybe being more likely to take those sorts of cases.
I did wonder whether this was evolving as a result of need, and I think that may be what prompted me to ask the question, because it is something that we hear so much about, and people are very sensitive about their dogs misbehaving or being seen as bad. So maybe it might be good to have a little look at just your average dog and what might lead your average dog to nip, because people get very upset if their dog nips. What would lead your average dog to just nip someone?
Yeah, so again, as I'm sure there's myriad of different reasons we could turn to there. But I would say, just in my experience, some of the big causes I see for, maybe a dog that's not actually had too many issues with people before. Maybe they're not a dog with a bite history, not a dog with a history of aggression, not a dog that's considered by their carers to be particularly anxious or particularly fearful. In those sorts of cases, I would say there's a couple of things that I seem to see come up a lot. And again, this is just what I see personally, so it's not necessarily to say these are the biggest causes. But one thing is the dog getting startled. So it might be someone's run up behind the dog unexpectedly, and then the dog didn't know that was going to happen, and then the dog just turns around and nips them because they weren't expecting that. And that sometimes could be a nip, sometimes it could be a higher level bite. That's where I've quite often seen bites, kind of graze level bites, or what we might call a level 2 bite, generally directed at people. It is one of those ones as well that I've seen quite commonly with kids and dogs as well. So that's where I think obviously there's lots of great stuff out there now about thinking about kids and dogs and how to keep children safe around dogs and keep dogs safe around children. And I think that's a really important one that people need to be aware of, and the general public need to be aware of, is actually startling dogs is a really good way to get yourself bitten, unfortunately. So kids particularly needing to be careful, need to be taught how to, if a dog's asleep, not to approach them, if a dog's not expecting someone to approach, giving them the dog the opportunity to come to them, all those sorts of things that we think of as kind of the basics for thinking around children and dogs. So I think that's one that I see a lot, the sort of the startle and the nip, and or the startle and the bite. And I think in a way, there's not a lot that we can necessarily do around that, in the sense of changing that dog's behavior. So in some cases, admittedly, you might have a dog that's very anxious and in a very high arousal state the whole time, and is therefore more likely to get startled and more likely to bite. But actually, for a lot of dogs, it might just be that they have quite a strong startle reflex, and that's just a part of their personality. And that's something we've got to acknowledge, and we've got to make sure we plan for and consider when we're putting our dog in those situations where they're going to be interacting with children, where you're having guests over in the house, actually making sure either we've got the dog in another room, if that's something that's feasible to do, making sure if you do have guests over, the dog is, monitored really closely. The guests are taught how to interact with the dog, and gets, given some instructions on, actually, if you want to say hi to the dog, that's cool, but we just got to make sure we don't startle him, because we don't want him to nip or bite. Yeah, I think planning ahead's a big one for that. But yeah, the other big one that I see come up is, I'd say it's often, and sometimes I would say this is possibly in the smaller dogs as well, more so than the startling. The startling I've seen with all sorts of different types of dogs, but again, sometimes with the smaller dogs, I think maybe because of they're a little bit more prone to frustration and anxiety because of their size sometimes, can be an over arousal situation. So, for example, we might have a dog that, this is again a common thing that I see, is situations where we've had a dog that hasn't had any history of aggression, and then maybe there's been a party or something like that, lots of people over, or kids have had friends over, and then suddenly this dog's bitten. Well, that's kind of how it's told to me. There's no warning, suddenly the dog's bitten. And kind of what we end up getting to the bottom of, or what we kind of end up finding in some of these cases, is there's been a lot of build up for that in terms of that dog's arousal. So the dog's been coping with lots of strange noises, lots of people running around the home. Maybe the dog's also been coping really, really well for the most part with people touching them. But maybe then we've got to a point where that dog's just got to their end of their tolerance. And that's not to say that's a feature of a bad nature in a dog. Getting to the end of your tolerance isn't just you deciding, or a dog just deciding, I don't care anymore, I'm just going to bite. It physically means, tolerance, when we're thinking about tolerance for those sorts of difficult situations, is a finite resource. It's something that runs out. We know that the frontal part of the brain, particularly around kind of your frontal lobes, find your forehead if you're a human, similarly if you're a dog, kind of that around that rough area, plays a big role in inhibiting some of those emotional responses. So when we've got a dog that's saying, oh crap, another person's touching me, oh crap, I've just heard a loud noise, and is trying not to respond to all that frontal cortex that's enabling that is only going to be able to do that for a certain period of time. It's actually a very metabolically demanding region of the brain to keep fueling. So if you're continually demanding resources from that, then that's going to run out pretty quickly. So that tolerance can often, just that end of that tolerance can often be reached. And I think that's often where we struggle with a bite instance. And we get that kind of paired with the dog's arousal increasing and increasing and increasing. And so those emotional systems become more charged. The frontal cortex, as his ability to inhibit, runs out, and then we just end up in a bite situation. So those are a couple that I see.
The startle reflex one, I think, is so important, because I think most people forget that it exists in humans, and it never occurs to them that it might exist in their dogs as well. But I've seen Teddy in situations where we're out and about, and something happens really quickly, like another dog comes from around a corner unseen, get very startled, and his reaction is to then bark and lunge aggressively. And I know what's happened. I can see it. It wasn't expected, and he was in a little world of his own, and suddenly, wham! There's a dog in his face, and he's going, "Rah! Get out of here!" So it's so you can completely see that. But the other thing where you're talking about the tolerance, his tolerance over the years for being handled for the purposes of, well, let's say veterinary treatment, has decreased and decreased and decreased to the point where recently, because of an ear infection, we've had to take the very difficult decision to muzzle him, to put eardrops in his ear. And so you can see, it's like, I hate you doing this. I hate you doing this. Please stop doing this. Please stop doing this. Oh no, not again. And now I am not going to tolerate this any longer. And in his instance, it wasn't like a big bite or anything, but you could feel that the nip was going to get more serious because his tolerance level was now at 0. And you were talking about frustration. I could feel his frustration in the desperation of saying, don't do this to me, and us still doing it to him. And so these are things that we really need to understand when we're living with our dogs, that they have feelings and that they can get frustrated and upset, and we can do our best. But sometimes, like in the case of putting eardrops in, the eardrops still have to go in. So it's that's why I listening to you, I thought this is such an important subject, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it really is. And I think it's an interesting subject you touched on there, really, in thinking about the emotional lives of dogs and how it's easy to assume perhaps that dogs have a very different emotional experience to us, or or don't have the same emotional experiences as us, or don't have the same level of emotional experiences, or don't have a startle reflex like we do. And I think what we need to realize is, or what we need to remember with that is, actually emotions are something that evolutionarily play a huge role in the survival of so many animals. I can't speak for every single animal, but certainly for many mammalian species, actually, if we think about what the emotions do, if we think about fear, that keeps us away from danger, keeps us away from potential threats to our existence. If we think about joy, that's actually what enables us to recognize some of those good things in life that promote our survival, whether we're talking about like maybe the more contentment style joy that we get if we're with loved ones, as Teddy is with you now, getting some nice sort of interaction. I don't know if he's still down there, but getting some nice interaction with you and actually getting to spend some time with his caregiver. Or if we think maybe about that kind of feeling of satisfaction that we get if we're a dog, right, and we've been digging around in the snuffle mat for ages and then we just found a little piece of chicken or something like that. So all those feelings are really, really key for promoting survival. And actually, even some of the more kind of off script emotions that we perhaps don't think about so often, like things like jealousy. So jealousy being that concern that someone else is going to get hold of your resource. And actually, it's quite important to differentiate jealousy from envy, right? So envy being wanting a resource someone else has got. So if I see that you've got a really nice TV or something, and I'm like, oh, I'd really like that TV. Whereas jealousy would be like if I had the new TV and then I was like, oh, actually, I'm a bit worried that Anna's going to try and nick my TV. And not that you would, I'm sure, but same with a dog, right? If you've got a really nice resource and we want to hang on to that, or if they see someone else as a nice resource, and again, whether they experience some of these emotions is a bit of an unknown at this point. There is some evidence that dogs experience jealousy. So there's some evidence that comes from what's known as fMRI data, which is basically this brain scanner that looks at the areas of your brain that light up when you're in certain situations. So, for example, in a human, if I was experiencing jealousy and I was in the fMRI scanner, so maybe they were threatening to take away something I wanted or whatever. I don't know what the jealousy paradigms they use for fMRI experiments in humans are actually, but then we might see certain areas in my brain light up. Now, they did a study looking at this in dogs, which I'm a bit dubious about, but I'll go through it very briefly. So basically, they had I believe something else of a fake dog in front of the scanner, that they were, or may have even been a real dog that they were feeding treats to. Had their owner feeding treats to. So basically, this is the idea of jealousy: your owner's spending time and giving affection to another animal. So they had that versus the owner just putting treats into a bucket. And they found that a region of the brain called the amygdala seemed to light up more when the dog was seeing the other dog being fed treats. And again, it's not to guarantee that dogs experience jealousy, because we know that the amygdala gets involved in any emotional or in lots of different emotional experiences of the brain. So it may be that there was just more emotions there when there was another animal involved, or something like that. But it's certainly an interesting one to consider, and I think we should all. I tend to try to avoid dismissing certainly the idea that dogs are experiencing a wide range of emotions, until at least we have evidence that they're not experiencing these emotions.
Well, now listening to you, I can think of 2 instances where Teddy absolutely expressed insecurity around my interaction with something else. And I'll tell you, they're both very illustrative of exactly what you're describing. So when he came home with us at 8 weeks, I slept with him in the spare room, and to work gradually to get him to sleep on his own. So I was sleeping with him, but he was not sleeping on the bed with me. He had a nice comfy crate on a dresser so that he was right next to me and was able to see me. But on the bed next to me was a teddy bear. Now, I remember on, I think, the second night, my partner saying to me, do you know, I think seeing that teddy bear there is distressing him. And I thought, no, can't be. We took the teddy bear away and he was fine. And I thought, interesting. Next night, I witnessed it. I went in, he's looking at the teddy bear, very upset. I put the teddy bear under the blanket so he couldn't see it. And he stopped immediately. Now, what was going on there? My interpretation is that either he was upset that what he thought might be another puppy was allowed on the bed and he wasn't, or maybe he wanted to have the teddy bear for himself. I don't know, but something was going on there. Fast forward, he is about 2.5, maybe 3 years old, and he has the very first sleepover where one of his friends comes. Now, this is a friend he knows, likes, they get on very well. He's had lots of friends come to visit the house, and they all go home. And he's always a little bit sad when they go home. He goes and sits by the door, hoping they'll come back. In this instance, the setup was different because we went and met Chester, and Chester, instead of going home with his family, came home with us. And it was actually, there was a huge downpour. And so I got the boys in, my partner toweled them down, and I ran upstairs to get changed because I was soaked. Chester came running up the stairs. Teddy followed. I'm making a fuss of both. Chester goes back downstairs. Teddy also leaves, but instead of following Chester into the kitchen, goes into the lounge. And suddenly I can hear crying. There's a dog crying. I'm thinking, uh-oh, what's happened? I go into the lounge and Teddy's having a little sob on his own. And I sit down with him and I talk to him and I said, so it's fine, you're still really important. It's all right. We go into the kitchen. I give both boys a chew. And Teddy is hesitant at first. And it takes maybe a couple of hours for him to realize that, yes, he is still going to be allowed on the sofa and he is still going to be allowed to do all the things he's normally allowed to do. Nothing's changed. And then he's fine. So again, my interpretation of that is there's something that's come in that's new and different. And what does that mean for me here? Does it mean that I've been demoted? I'm less important? What does it mean? So I don't know that it's jealousy as we would define it for human beings, but it's certainly distress of some kind. So I think it's just showing that the feelings they have are perhaps closer to us than we think.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it sounds like that's a very good interpretation that, I wouldn't necessarily take from that situation that it definitely means that he's experiencing jealousy, but it is certainly, as you say, he's seeing those new things, whether it be the other dog in the house, whether it be the teddy bear on the bed, not quite sure what the consequences of that is, whether it's, for example, the teddy bear, whether it's another little dog or something like that, whether he should be a bit cautious around that, whether it's a resource that he actually wants to have more control over. So that's concerning him, all sorts of different things that could be going through his head. And I think another thing we also have to think about in these scenarios is it's not necessarily, these things aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. It could be that he's a little bit concerned about this new situation, but then he also maybe wants to have access to that teddy bear as well. Or maybe he's excited to see the other dog in the house, but he also is a little bit concerned around having food at the same time as him as well. So there's all sorts of things that could be going on there.
Exactly. But what we can say definitely is that he was uncomfortable and that I was in both instances very aware of that and wanting to help him to be comfortable. And of course, since then, our house often has little overnight guests and he's very happy with that. And he's never been a dog who's not happy to share me as a resource. But it was just those two situations where I thought, is this jealousy? I don't know. But one thing I do know is that it's definitely insecurity. And so it's just gave me an insight into, it reminded me of toddlers, that toddler mentality of, oh, I don't know, somebody new's come in and maybe I'm not going to get as much as attention as I usually get. It just had that feel about it. So when you're talking about the amygdala lighting up, yeah, I can see it completely.
Mm.
And you can also see how situations like that could maybe in another dog that's feeling less secure lead to something else.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the interesting things to look at is the differentials that are at play in terms of what might cause one dog to react and one dog not to. So obviously, if we think of Teddy and you were discussing a little bit where Teddy's tolerance was earlier, it sounds like for new things, novel things in the house, maybe he is a little bit concerned by that, and we can see a little bit of insecurity there. But actually, that sounds like something he copes quite well with. Whereas we know that at the vet now, things have gone a little bit downhill with his coping ability there. And that kind of tells us a little bit about how that dog's emotional systems, the emotional systems within their brain, have been programmed. So there's a lot of things that can go on there that we can think about there in terms of what's going to be influencing the brain and how it reacts, down to the dog's genetics and the dog's breeding. So we can think about both their breed, which might have some impact, but also their breeding line and their individual genetic sequence and how that can influence their stress processing, and also their epigenetics. So this is this idea that our genes aren't fixed in the sense that they're constantly being read throughout our lives and constantly being transcribed and processed to create different proteins and different chemicals throughout our body, throughout our life. And we can change the rate at which these chemicals and which these proteins are built, which will influence our behavior. So to give you an example, if we think of the serotonin system, there's different ways that so the serotonin system being this system in the brain, that is very much involved in mood and emotional regulation. And there are different ways that our genes, depending on our environment that we end up in, regulate the infrastructure of our serotonin system. So what that means is if you think of serotonin as being like your car going down the motorway, your environment can influence the way that motorway is built. So whether it's a motorway or whether it's a single track country lane that's going to be really, really tricky to get a car down, or a motorway, which perhaps slightly ironic to talk about in the UK with our motorways mostly being full of car parks, but but it's going to be, in theory, a nice, fast, quick ride. So that's another thing that we can think about, is actually the way our epigenetics are influencing our emotional systems, and the way our environment influences the way our genes are read, whether the genes are read that facilitate good coping in situations like that, or genes are read that maybe facilitate our brain being more ready to panic and more ready to react, or react as if something's a threat in those sorts of situations. And then, of course, developmental experience, again, really, really huge. So what that animal has been exposed to, what sort of socialization experiences that animal's had, whether that animal's had good learning experiences around that stimulus, whether they've not had good learning experiences, and also how their stress physiology has developed, actually, how they've learned to manage their own stress and regulate their own emotions as a result of their development, all play really, really big roles in how a dog responds in a given moment. Which is why, of course, we can have two dogs that can experience the same stressor and have a very, very different reaction.
We're talking about genetics. I was going to ask you about breeds, and whether, because we are very encouraged in the media to believe that certain breeds are much more aggressive than others. What is your experience of that?
I think it's a very hard question to give an answer to, because, of course, in the UK, we know that large bull breeds have been involved in more fatalities than other dogs in the last few years. So there is a reason to be concerned about certain types of dogs. And I think one aspect is size, right? Because if you're a larger dog and you're involved in a dog attack, then that just by nature of it means that the threat is much greater with a larger dog than a Chihuahua or something really small. So that's one factor. And then also we have to think about the situation that breeds end up in. So, for example, there may be certain demographics of people, so certain groups of people that look for particular dogs. So that might mean that certain breeds of dogs are more likely to end up in situations where perhaps their needs aren't being met very well. Perhaps they've experienced some really poor training methods. Perhaps they're in really poor environments. And that could be a factor that puts them at higher risk. That's not to say they are or they aren't, but it certainly could be a factor that we could think about. Because if certain breeds are more desirable to certain people, then that's going to increase the odds of those dogs being in problematic situations, in those dog attack situations. And then we can also think about, again, within breed, we've got to think about breeding line. So if we've got a line of dogs, so breeding line, I mean that kind of dog's direct line of inheritance, what those dogs' parents were, the genetic makeup of the dog's parents, the genetic makeup of the dog's grandparents and great-grandparents. Thinking about that and what influence that has, because you can take any breed you like. You can take, say, is Teddy a cockapoo?
Yes.
So we can take cockapoos. Cockapoos might be a bit more complicated because they are obviously crosses, but we can say we can take cockapoos. And if I was a really good breeder and really experienced breeder, which I'm not, so I would be a bit probably overstating to say I could do this. But if it was a really experienced breeder, I could take cockapoos, and I could breed towards really, really high levels of aggression towards people, or really, really high levels of aggression towards other dogs. And I could make that what I'm breeding for. I may, and then I could similarly breed another line of cockapoos, and I aim to select the dogs to breed with that show really, really, really high levels of affectionate behavior and loving behavior towards humans, which is probably more what's happened with cockapoos historically, because that's one of the big ideas of some of those toy breeds, is to breed them towards being really, really affectionate towards humans and really happy to engage with humans and really social, which certainly has upsides and downsides for the dog, which we can talk about as well. But this is something that we do with dogs, and historically what breeders do with dogs, right? They can breed and select for certain traits, which is quite weird to think about when we actually kind of think about that. We don't really do that with any other animals to the same extent, certainly. And we may breed, or try and selectively breed in zoos and situations like that, or with cats, towards health and things like that. And obviously some breeds within cats, but it's quite an unusual thing that we're doing. And although you may see between those two lines of cockapoos, I think you very likely see they end up with morphological differences. So they'll probably look different. There are probably physical traits that are attached to being more aggressive to humans versus more social and affectionate towards humans. But even so, within a breeding line, we can select for certain behaviors, and all those behaviors can be selected for just due to poor breeding. So we might have a breeding line that just drifts towards being more aggressive towards humans due to poor breeding. And it can be particularly with males, right? If we think of male stud dogs, they potentially are the fathers to a lot of litters of dogs. So if you get one male dog that perhaps hasn't been identified as being an aggressive dog, but maybe has a genetic predisposition that if it ends up in the right circumstance, could be an aggressive dog. So perhaps we get some offspring that are more predisposed towards aggression and these high conflict scenarios, then we could be in real trouble. So there's a lot to think about with breeding and the implications that are at play with particular breeding lines. And I would say your breeding line is likely to be a much better predictor of your behavior than your breed itself. The actual breed itself, in many cases, I would say is not a very good predictor of whether that dog is likely to be aggressive or not. There are some breeds that seem to be more predictive of aggressive behavior, but with many breeds, it doesn't tend to be a very good predictor.
I think it's really important what you said, though, about the epigenetic side of it, and the very fact that circumstances can determine also which way a dog is going to go. And I've often thought, these bull breeds are in the news. It's inevitable because, as you said, a bite from one of them is going to be far more serious than little Dachshund or a Chihuahua. So we're going to take that much more seriously because the threat is greater. But at the same time, as you said, certain type of people who shouldn't be having dogs like that are attracted to dogs like that. And as it's like a recipe for disaster, because it's also about the intention of what people want out of a dog. And so it's, I think these are all things that we do need to think about very carefully. And certainly what happens all too often is that the dog gets the blame. And that's why I wanted to have the opportunity to speak with you, because I think we all need to be much more aware of the fact that our dogs have feelings, and that we have far more control over situations than they do. And so therefore it is our responsibility to help them as much as we can.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And I think emotionally engaging with dogs is super, super important for really being able to build that relationship with them and be able to build that understanding and have a successful shared experience in terms of that dog's lifestyle living with you. I think actually recognizing that dog's emotional experience and yeah, being able to engage with that and being able to find ways for that dog's emotional experience to be something that is a good experience for them, that you want them to be able to go away when they pass away and they want leave this world to have had, good welfare, have experienced those positive emotions in life. So I think, yeah, the more we can engage with our dog's emotional experiences, the better for sure.
The better for them and the better for us, because I think that the more we do that, actually it makes us better human beings in general, because the sensitivity that we develop when we're tuning into our dogs to better understand them, in my experience, means that we're teaching ourselves to be more sensitive in general to the needs of others. So I think that, they come into our lives, they're teaching us to be more sensitive, for those of us who are willing to engage at that level. And I think they're turning us into better human beings too. So it's a win for everyone, if we're prepared to actually engage in that way.
Yeah, absolutely.
And for you now, you obviously are helping people with all sorts of issues. So you are a wonderful port of call for anyone struggling. Do you are based in Kent, if I remember?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
And do you just work with people in your local area, or do you work online as well?
So yeah, we do online stuff. I've got quite a few clients that work virtually, but yeah, and then we also see people in person throughout Kent, Southeast London, a little bit of Essex, a little bit of East Sussex. So yeah, a few different places.
Perfect. So what is your website?
Oh, it's a test. It is animalbehaviourkent.co.uk.
I will be putting a link to that in the description box, so that everyone can find you and
Thank you.
get the help that they need, for their wonderful dogs. Thank you so much for your time today, Daniel.
No problem. It was lovely to be here.
And thank you all for watching. Until next time, goodbye.